For decades, Toys R Us was more than just a store. It was a destination. Rows of brightly colored aisles, towering shelves, and the feeling that anything you could imagine was waiting somewhere inside. At its peak, Toys R Us wasn't just the largest toy retailer in the world. It defined how toys were sold. So when the company collapsed, many assumed the explanation was simple. Online shopping had taken over. Amazon had won, and Toys R Us had been left behind. But that explanation misses the real story. Because Toys R Us didn't fail because people stopped buying toys. It failed because it lost the ability to adapt. Toys R Us was built on scale. By the 1980s and 1990s, the company had perfected a model that competitors struggled to match: massive stores, unmatched selection, and pricing power driven by sheer volume. Manufacturers needed Toys R Us more than Toys R Us needed them. That leverage allowed the company to dominate shelf space, dictate terms, and undercut smaller retailers. For years, the strategy worked exactly as intended. But scale came with trade-offs. Large stores required long planning cycles. Inventory decisions had to be made months in advance. And the business became increasingly dependent on predictability. The system was efficient, but it was not flexible. As long as consumer behavior remained stable, Toys R Us could thrive, but stability was already disappearing. In the late 1990s, online retail was still viewed as an experiment. Toys R Us didn't ignore the internet, but it didn't fully commit to it either. E-commerce was treated as an add-on, not a core capability. Rather than building its own digital infrastructure, the company chose a shortcut. In 2000, Toys R Us partnered with Amazon, allowing Amazon to manage its online sales. At the time, the decision seemed practical. Toys R Us would focus on physical stores. Amazon would handle the internet. But the partnership quietly transferred something far more important than logistics: customer data, fulfillment expertise, and direct relationships with online shoppers. Amazon was learning how consumers behaved online, while Toys R Us remained largely removed from the process. When the partnership eventually ended, Amazon had gained invaluable experience. Toys R Us had gained very little. By outsourcing its digital future, the company delayed learning how to compete online and lost critical time it would never recover. The most consequential moment in Toys R Us history didn't happen online. It happened on paper. In 2005, the company was acquired by a group of private equity firms in a leveraged buyout. The deal loaded Toys R Us with billions of dollars in debt. Almost overnight, the company's priorities shifted. Instead of focusing on long-term competitiveness, the business became centered around servicing interest payments. Cash flow that could have funded experimentation or modernization was redirected toward maintaining financial stability. Debt didn't just limit investment, it reshaped decision-making. Projects had to justify themselves quickly. Risk became something to avoid rather than manage, and flexibility became increasingly expensive. The company wasn't structured to adapt anymore. It was structured to endure. That rigidity mattered most when experimentation became essential. Retail was no longer about getting everything right the first time. It was about testing store formats, testing pricing models, testing fulfillment options. But experimentation requires tolerance for failure, and failure requires financial flexibility. Toys R Us had neither. Every new idea carried risk, and risk carried consequences the company could no longer afford. Unlike newer competitors, Toys R Us couldn't afford to pilot small changes and learn from them. It had to commit fully, or not at all. That meant innovation slowed, not because leaders lacked ideas, but because the cost of being wrong had become too high. When adaptability depends on perfection, adaptability disappears. As competitors refined their online platforms and logistics, Toys R Us struggled to keep pace. Stores aged, layouts stagnated, and the in-store experience failed to evolve. Inventory systems remained rigid, pricing pressure increased, and seasonal demand swings placed constant strain on operations. The company was still large, but size no longer translated into advantage. In a faster-moving retail environment, rigidity became a liability. Toys R Us didn't lack awareness of what was happening around it. It lacked the freedom to respond meaningfully. By the mid-2000s, the situation had become unsustainable. Online competitors moved faster, big-box retailers diversified their offerings, and consumer expectations shifted toward convenience and speed. Toys R Us still sold toys, but the margin for error had vanished. With heavy debt, declining flexibility, and limited room to invest, the company had no space left to experiment. Small mistakes became existential. When sales softened, there was no buffer. In 2017, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy, not because toys stopped selling, but because adaptability had already been exhausted. Toys R Us didn't fail because the internet arrived. It failed because debt removed its ability to respond when the world changed. The company wasn't slow to recognize disruption. It was slow to act, because acting had become too expensive. The lesson isn't about toys, or retail, or even e-commerce. It's about flexibility. Because in business, survival isn't determined by size or history. It's determined by how quickly a company can change, before change becomes unavoidable.